The stars above the galaxy's outer rim burned like a dying ember in the cold expanse of space. The warship's hull echoed with the heavy breath of its crew, the air charged with a tense stillness that could break at any moment. In the heart of the command deck, the galaxy's most feared conqueror stood, her figure like a storm in human form, a woman whose very name sent entire civilizations to their knees. But even she froze in that instant, caught off guard by a moment of tenderness so alien to her world, when the unlikeliest of souls, a humble janitor, cradled her terrified child in his arms. Before we dive into the galaxy-shifting events that followed, let us know where you're watching from. If stories like this move you, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will reveal even more shocking twists than this one. The hum of the warship's engines reverberated through the cold, metallic walls, a constant reminder of the galaxy's endless chaos. Commander Zorath, ruler of Threxion, stood in the center of the vast, sterile command deck, her eyes scanning the endless horizon displayed on the holographic screen before her. The darkness of space stretched in every direction, with only the faint glimmer of distant stars to remind her that there was life beyond the warship's iron hold. Zorath's mind raced with the orders she had just given, her empire expanding at an unprecedented rate. Her reputation as the galaxy's most brutal conqueror had been cemented by years of merciless campaigns and the submission of countless worlds. Yet, on this day, she felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts, something she had never allowed herself to entertain. Doubt. A cry shattered the eerie silence of the command deck. It wasn't a battle cry or a call for victory. No, it was the unmistakable sound of a frightened child, a cry that resonated with innocence, raw and vulnerable. Zorath froze. The air seemed to grow colder around her as her eyes instinctively shifted toward the sound. It came from the observation bay. The bay, typically a place of quiet reflection for the warship's elite, was now the site of something unexpected. A figure, barely more than a child, stood there, her tiny form trembling in the arms of a human janitor. His weathered face held an expression of fierce protection as he cradled the alien child close, shielding her from the cold, indifferent world outside the ship's walls. Zorath's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't move. The woman who had brought entire civilizations to their knees, who had once watched 1,000 cities fall in a single night, was now frozen in place, her cold composure shaken by the sight of a human janitor, a figure so beneath her in status, showing such tenderness to her daughter. She had expected fear, obedience, and submission. But not this. Not this raw, unfiltered moment of humanity. Who dares interrupt the sanctity of my command? Zorath's voice was low, almost a growl, but there was a hesitation in it, an uncertainty she quickly masked. The room seemed to hold its breath as the janitor turned, his face pale but resolute. He met the Queen's piercing gaze with an almost defiant calmness. "I was just protecting her," he said softly, his voice steady despite the weight of Zorath's gaze. "She's just a child." Zorath's eyes narrowed. This janitor, insignificant in her empire's grand scheme, had done what no one in her entire legion had dared to do: show compassion. And now, standing before her, he held her child in a way that was too tender for someone who had never known the weight of such care. In the vast emptiness of space, it was as though time itself had paused. Zorath's thoughts swirled, torn between the instinct to assert her power and the unfamiliar warmth that flickered inside her chest, a warmth she had long buried beneath the cold exterior of her rule. Zorath's eyes flickered between the janitor and her trembling child, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the cold vacuum of space itself. For the first time, she felt something other than control and power, a pang of vulnerability. It was a fleeting sensation, one she quickly buried beneath the layers of her hardened exterior. But it was there, lingering, threatening to crack the fortress she had built around herself. The child in the janitor's arms, her skin shimmering with soft hues of violet, stared up at Zorath with wide, unblinking eyes. The fear in those eyes was unmistakable, yet there was something else to trust. The child, a princess in a world of bloodshed, had chosen the comfort of a stranger over her mother's indifference. "You should not be here," Zorath finally spoke, her voice sharp as a blade. The command deck seemed to grow colder, the sterile walls reflecting the tension in the air. The janitor, though shaking under the Queen's icy stare, did not step back. Instead, he held the child closer, as if to shield her from the storm that was about to rage. "She was scared," he said, his voice carrying a strength that belied his humble position. "She didn't want to be alone." Zorath's breath hitched, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something in the janitor's eyes. Pity for her, for the Queen who had long ruled without mercy, without care. It was a look she could not tolerate. But before she could speak, the child stretched out a tiny hand toward her, her trembling fingers reaching for Zorath, as though she sought solace in her presence. The sight stopped Zorath in her tracks. This child, her child, had been raised in a world where strength was the only currency, where emotions were weaknesses to be exploited, and yet, here she was, reaching for the one person who had never shown her love, the woman who had given birth to her. Zorath's heart twisted, and for a moment she felt the full weight of her role as a mother, a role she had never allowed herself to embrace. Her empire, her soldiers, her warships, they had all been built on the backs of those she had crushed beneath her heel. And yet, in this moment, with the child's tiny hand outstretched, Zorath realized that everything she had fought for could crumble in an instant. Her fingers twitched, a battle raging inside her. The cold Queen, the Conqueror, and the Mother, both at war within her own heart. She took a step forward, and then another. The janitor's eyes widened in surprise, but he did not move. "I will take her," Zorath said, her voice soft yet firm. "Return to your duties." Zorath cradled her child carefully, her hands trembling only slightly as she pulled the small figure from the janitor's grasp. The child's tiny form felt impossibly fragile in her arms, as if one wrong move could shatter the delicate trust that had been forged in this moment. The janitor stood still, watching, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and quiet relief. He was a mere servant in the grand scheme of things, but in this room, in this fleeting moment, he had become something more, something Zorath couldn't quite understand. As she walked toward the observation bay, the weight of her child in her arms, she felt the familiar coldness of the command deck slip away, replaced by a sense of responsibility. A responsibility that she had always avoided, preferring the cold detachment of ruling with fear, not love. The child rested her head against Zorath's chest, her soft alien skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Zorath's heart, long buried beneath layers of iron and cruelty, began to stir. This was not a battle to be won or lost, no world to be conquered. This was something much more intimate, something she had never allowed herself to feel, a bond between mother and child that no empire could command. Zorath stopped near the large viewport, her eyes tracing the endless expanse of stars beyond the warship. The galaxy stretched out before her, an untamed wilderness of worlds and wars waiting to be claimed. Yet, for the first time in her life, it felt distant, irrelevant. The stars, once so full of power and promise, now seemed cold and indifferent. She had built her empire on the suffering of others, on the cruelty that came with ruling with an iron fist. But in her arms, this child, her child, offered a different kind of power, a power she had never known. She stared out at the stars, her grip on the child tightening ever so slightly, not out of fear, but out of something more profound: protectiveness. Zorath had always seen herself as an unstoppable force, a conqueror whose power was unchallenged. But now, in the quiet of the observation bay, she realized that for all her victories, she had been running from something far more dangerous than any army, the love she had denied for so long. "Your mother is not a monster," Zorath whispered softly to the child, though she knew her words were as much for herself as they were for the innocent soul in her arms. "But I have forgotten how to be anything but one." The child stirred in her arms, her eyes fluttering open, filled with a strange mixture of trust and innocence. She reached up, her tiny hand touching Zorath's face, as if to reassure her, as if to say that even a queen with blood on her hands could still be worthy of love. And for the first time in years, Zorath didn't pull away. The hum of the warship's engines faded into the background as Zorath stood still, her child nestled in her arms. The soft, rhythmic pulse of the ship's heart seemed to mirror the gentle rise and fall of her own breath. Her grip on the child tightened ever so slightly, though she remained careful not to hurt her. This child, her daughter, was a piece of her soul she had never fully understood, yet something in her heart now pulled her to protect her, no matter the cost. But protection in Zorath's world came at a high price. The weight of the galaxy's expectations pressed down on her like the weight of 1,000 suns. A queen did not show weakness, a conqueror did not show mercy. The cruelty she had cultivated in herself, honed like a blade over years of war, was the very thing that had brought her to this moment. It had made her invincible, but it had also made her incapable of tenderness. Now, as her child looked up at her with trusting eyes, Zorath felt the strain of it all. Could she really change? Could she allow herself to be more than the ruthless ruler the universe had come to fear? In the distance, the silhouette of a nearby moon loomed, its barren surface a constant reminder of the consequences of Zorath's choices. She had wiped out entire populations, left countless worlds in ruin, and had never once questioned her actions. But now, standing here, with her daughter's tiny hand grasping her finger, it felt as though the galaxy's harsh truths were beginning to crack, exposing something fragile inside her. "What do I do now?" Zorath whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "How do I protect you from the world I've created?" The child shifted in her arms, her delicate fingers brushing against the cold metal of the command deck. The innocence in her touch was like a sharp contrast to the hard edges of the world Zorath had built. She wanted to protect her, but how could she, when the very foundation of her empire was built on control and fear? How could she be both a mother and the galaxy's most brutal conqueror? For a brief moment, Zorath allowed herself to close her eyes, shutting out the weight of her responsibilities. In the silence of the observation bay, she felt her resolve begin to shift. This was no longer just about power. This was about something far more human, a bond she could no longer ignore. The quiet moment, however, was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. The janitor from earlier, Elias, stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. His presence was a reminder of the impossible truth Zorath had been trying to avoid. The galaxy was not made of conquerors and subjects alone. There were those who lived in the shadows, who did the work no one else cared to acknowledge, yet it was their very existence that made everything else possible. Zorath's eyes met Elias's. "You should not be here," she said, her voice low, though there was no longer any anger in it, just a raw, unspoken truth. Elias bowed his head, but there was no fear in his eyes. "I've done my part, Your Majesty," he said softly. "It's yours now." And with that, the Queen realized the truth. There was no going back. Zorath turned her gaze back to the viewport, where the cold expanse of space stretched endlessly before her. She could feel the weight of her title pressing on her chest, heavier now than it had ever been before. A conqueror, a ruler of worlds. But in this moment, as she cradled her child against her, she realized that titles meant nothing when faced with something as raw and human as love. The child stirred in her arms, her tiny hands reaching up to tug at Zorath's uniform. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to snap Zorath out of her thoughts. She looked down at the child's innocent face and felt the pull of something deeper, something she had denied for so long. She had been a queen, feared and respected, but now, standing in this quiet bay with her child, she felt like nothing more than a woman who didn't know what to do with the tenderness swelling inside her. Elias's quiet presence behind her reminded her of the worlds she had crushed to build her empire, the countless lives sacrificed to fuel her ambition. She had built a kingdom of ashes, but she had never understood what it meant to protect what mattered most. Now, with her daughter in her arms, she was beginning to realize the cost of her power. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed," Zorath said, her voice quiet, almost to herself. "Something I thought I could never have." Elias, still standing in the doorway, nodded without a word. He had seen the change in her, felt it in the very air around them, but he did not push. His duty, after all, had always been to stay in the shadows. He was the janitor, invisible to all but those who needed him. But in that moment, he was something more, a witness to the silent shift taking place within the Queen. Zorath's grip on her child tightened. There was no going back from this. The path she had chosen, this journey towards something softer, more fragile than Empire, would not be an easy one. The galaxy did not forgive weakness, and neither did her heart. But for the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her, a flicker of hope, a hope that she could be something other than the monster she had made herself out to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the quiet hum of a comm system. It was a sharp reminder of the world outside the warship, the demands that would soon come rushing back. Zorath inhaled deeply, her eyes flicking toward Elias. "Take her to the nursery," Zorath said, her voice firm once again, the queen returning to the forefront. "I will not be kept waiting." Elias nodded, understanding the command without needing to be told twice. As he turned to leave, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. "You'll figure it out," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "We all do, in the end." Zorath didn't respond, but she felt the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. It was the first time in a long while that someone had spoken to her as though she were something more than the crown on her head, more than the fears and duties that defined her. With her child in her arms and the weight of the universe pressing against her, Zorath realized that perhaps there was a different kind of power waiting for her to claim, one that wasn't defined by the wars she had waged, but by the love she could give. The nursery was quieter than Zorath had expected. It was a small, intimate space, far removed from the cold, sterile corridors of the warship. The walls were adorned with soft, glowing patterns that flickered like distant stars, casting a peaceful glow across the room. It was a place of warmth, a stark contrast to the harsh world Zorath had built outside. Zorath stood at the entrance for a moment, her eyes taking in the serene atmosphere. The room felt foreign to her, a space where she had never belonged. She had ruled planets, commanded armies, and destroyed empires. But this room, this life was something entirely different. It was fragile. It was real. She glanced down at the child in her arms, whose delicate fingers were wrapped tightly around Zorath's finger. The child's eyes fluttered as she settled into the cradle, her breath soft and steady. Zorath stood there, her gaze fixed on the tiny figure, a feeling rising within her that she could barely comprehend. She had never been a mother, she had never allowed herself to be. But now, in this quiet space, she realized that perhaps the most important battle she would face was not against her enemies, but against herself. Zorath's heart, long hardened by years of conquest, now seemed to beat with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, vulnerable. She wanted to turn away, to retreat to the cold embrace of her throne and her empire, but something in the room, the soft, trusting gaze of her daughter, held her in place. Her mind flashed back to the moments before, when Elias had stood silently in the doorway. The janitor, a man who had no claim to power, had somehow understood something that Zorath herself had long ignored, that there was more to life than the strength to conquer. There was a strength in softness, in compassion, a strength that could rebuild what had been broken. But could she embrace that strength? Could she allow herself to break free from the iron grip of her empire? Zorath inhaled deeply and placed her hand gently on her daughter's tiny head. The warmth of the child's skin beneath her fingers stirred something deep within her. This was her flesh and blood. This was her legacy, and it was not one that could be built on the ruins of others. A voice broke through the silence, soft and distant. "Your Majesty, there are matters that require your attention," a messenger called from outside the nursery. Zorath took one last lingering glance at her daughter before turning toward the door. The weight of her title pressed against her chest once more, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. "I'll be there shortly," she called back, her voice steady, but for the first time in years, not cold. As she stepped away from the nursery, Zorath knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The galaxy had been built on the idea that power was absolute, that those who ruled would be unyielding. But she was beginning to see that real power, the kind that could change the universe, might not come from strength at all. It might come from the ability to protect the ones we love, even if it meant sacrificing everything we've ever known. Zorath's steps were slow as she moved through the corridors of her warship. The heavy, mechanical hum of the engines was a constant backdrop to her thoughts, but it seemed distant now. Each footstep felt heavier, more deliberate, as though the weight of the galaxy was pressing down on her once more. She had always been certain. Her rule was built on certainty, on the cold logic that only the strong could survive. There was no room for weakness, no time for doubt. Yet, ever since the moment she had cradled her child, a flicker of uncertainty had crept into her heart. It was a dangerous thing, this doubt. It threatened to undo everything she had worked for. As she passed the command center, the door slid open before her, and she was greeted by the usual assembly of officers and military strategists. They stood at attention, their faces impassive, waiting for her to speak. "Your Majesty," Commander Juno said, her voice clipped. "We've received new reports from the Outer Rim. Several planets are resisting our occupation." Zorath's gaze hardened, her mind immediately returning to the familiar calculations of power. She was a conqueror, a ruler who crushed resistance beneath her boots. But today, her thoughts felt fragmented, as though someone was pulling her in a different direction. "Prepare the fleet," Zorath replied, her voice sharp, though her words felt hollow. "We'll deal with this swiftly." Her officers nodded and began to disperse. But Zorath's mind was elsewhere. She could feel the pull of her daughter, safe in the nursery, and for the first time, the violence of her past felt like an echo rather than a calling. Juno lingered, sensing something had changed. "Is everything all right, Your Majesty?" Zorath didn't answer immediately. She simply stared out of the window at the stars, her thoughts swirling. The universe had always been a place of conquest, of dominance. She had built her empire on that foundation. But now, she wondered what would be left of that empire if she began to question the very things that had brought her power. "Tell the fleet to stand by," Zorath finally said, her voice softening. "We'll wait." Juno gave her a confused look but said nothing, nodding curtly before she left the room. Zorath stood alone in the silence, the weight of her crown pressing heavily on her head. She had always believed that power was about control, about bending the universe to her will. But in that moment, she realized that perhaps true power wasn't in the wars she fought, but in the love she was now learning to protect. And that, more than anything, terrified her. The silence in the command room was thick, suffocating. Zorath sat at the head of the long obsidian table, her fingers resting lightly on the cool surface. She hadn't moved since dismissing her officers, her mind tangled in conflicting thoughts. She had always been decisive, always driven by one thing, power. But now, as she stared at the stars flickering outside the viewport, something within her had shifted. The question wasn't how to conquer, but whether it was worth it. What good was an empire if it crumbled under the weight of its own cruelty? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elias stepped into the room, his presence a quiet contrast to the usual storm of military commanders and strategists. He looked at her with an unspoken understanding, as if he knew the turmoil inside her without needing to say a word. "You've been quiet, Your Majesty," he said softly, his gaze steady. "The fleet waits for your command." Zorath met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see the janitor, the invisible man who swept the floors of her empire. She saw someone who had become more than just a servant, someone who had shown her what it meant to care. She sighed, standing slowly and turning to face him fully. "I've always known how to conquer," she admitted, her voice raw. "I've built an empire on it, but I don't know how to do this. Protect what matters." Elias remained silent, allowing her the space to speak. The queen, who had once crushed entire civilizations beneath her heel, now stood before him vulnerable and uncertain, and yet, in that moment, she seemed more powerful than ever. "I don't know if I can protect her," Zorath murmured, her voice breaking for the first time. "If I can change." Elias took a step forward, his presence gentle but unwavering. "You don't have to change all at once, Your Majesty. Just take one step, one choice at a time." Zorath's eyes closed for a brief moment, as if the weight of his words were too much to bear. She had always relied on her strength, her will, to dictate the galaxy's fate. But now, standing here with Elias, she realized that true strength wasn't just about conquering sometimes, it was about choosing not to. Her thoughts drifted back to her daughter, asleep in the nursery. The thought of raising her in a world of endless war seemed impossible now, and yet, she knew there was no turning back from this new path. The decision was hers to make. "Stand down the fleet," Zorath said, her voice firm again, but softer than it had been in years. "We'll find another way." Elias nodded quietly, his eyes full of understanding. "Yes, Your Majesty." As he turned to leave, Zorath stood alone at the viewport, her hands clenched at her sides. She was no longer just a queen of conquest. She was a mother, a protector, and that was a title that came with a price. But it was one she was finally ready to pay. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Zorath had ordered the fleet to stand down, a decision that shocked her officers, who had never seen their queen act with such hesitation. The Outer Rim worlds, once destined for swift occupation, were now left in uncertain silence. The ships hovered, waiting for a command that never came. Zorath spent her time in the nursery, learning the rhythms of motherhood that she had never allowed herself to embrace. The child, her daughter, grew stronger each day, her laughter a soft melody that filled the air, cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the warship. Zorath marveled at the simple joy that radiated from the tiny being in her arms. It was a stark contrast to the destruction and chaos that had once defined her existence. As she held her daughter, Zorath couldn't help but think of the worlds she had conquered, the lives she had destroyed in the name of power. But the question that lingered now was not how many more worlds she could claim, but how she could protect the future of this child, the future of something gentler, something that didn't rely on domination and fear. One morning, as Zorath stood by the window watching the stars, Elias approached her, his presence quiet but strong. He had been a constant since that first moment in the nursery, a steady figure who never pushed her but always provided a quiet strength. "You've made a decision," Elias said, his voice gentle, but knowing. Zorath looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if it's the right one," she admitted, her voice tinged with doubt. "But it feels like the only choice left." Elias gave her a small, understanding smile. "The right choice isn't always the easiest one, Your Majesty, but it's the one that matters." Zorath turned back to the viewport, her eyes scanning the vastness of space. The empire she had built was vast, filled with strength and fear. But the empire she had imagined for her daughter would be different. It would be one built on compassion, not conquest. On care, not control. "I want to rebuild," Zorath said quietly, her voice stronger now. "Not destroy. I want to leave a legacy of something more than bloodshed." Elias nodded, his eyes full of quiet pride. "A legacy of peace is harder to build than one of war, but it's worth it." Zorath's gaze softened as she looked down at her daughter, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to face it, not as a conqueror, but as a protector. Her journey had changed. The battles ahead would be different, not fought with weapons or armies, but with a new kind of strength, one that came from within. And that strength, Zorath realized, was the greatest power of all. Zorath stood in the heart of her warship, the room now dimly lit, the cold hum of engines a constant backdrop to her thoughts. The warship, once a symbol of dominance, now felt like a shell, a relic of a past she could no longer embrace. Her officers had gathered in the command center, awaiting her orders. But this time, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a quiet tension in the air, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. A palpable uncertainty about the queen they had once feared, who now seemed different. Zorath's mind wandered to the decisions she had made, the choices that had led her here. The moment in the nursery when she had first held her daughter felt like a turning point. But it wasn't until now, standing before her loyal officers, that she realized just how far she had come. She had traded one empire for another, a fragile empire built not on conquest, but on the promise of something better. Her daughter, now resting in the care of the nursery staff, was the future. She was a future Zorath had once thought was impossible, one that wasn't governed by fear, but by the quiet, powerful force of love. "Your Majesty," Commander Juno spoke, breaking the silence. "The fleet awaits your decision." Zorath turned to face her officers, her gaze steady but calm. The hard edges of the conqueror she had once been had softened, but the queen within her was still there. She had learned to balance power with compassion, to rule not with fear, but with wisdom. "We will no longer seek to conquer," Zorath declared, her voice firm and clear. "Our path forward is one of rebuilding. We will offer the worlds we once sought to dominate the opportunity to heal, to grow. We will forge alliances not through force but through understanding." A murmur ran through the officers. Some looked uncertain, others confused, but all of them felt the weight of her words. The galaxy they had known, the galaxy Zorath had built, was changing before their very eyes. Juno stepped forward. "You wish to change everything, Your Majesty?" Zorath met her eyes, her expression resolute. "Yes, it is time for something new. No more war. No more bloodshed." Elias entered the room, standing just behind the queen. He had been a quiet force in her transformation, a reminder that there was strength in gentleness, power in humility. He met Zorath's gaze with a soft smile, his presence a silent affirmation of everything she had come to realize. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Zorath felt the weight of her decisions hanging in the air. It was a heavy burden, but it was hers to bear. She had not become the queen she was by turning away from challenges. But this challenge was different. It was the challenge of forging a new path, one that would take time, patience, and understanding. And with that, Zorath made a vow to herself and to the galaxy. The empire she would leave behind would not be defined by war, but by the strength of the bonds forged in peace. A legacy that would outlast her rule, a legacy that would live on in the hearts of those she protected. Her daughter would grow up in a world where love was the strongest force, not fear. And that, Zorath realized, was the true measure of a queen.